pussy. Well, now Ted can get in on the action. For example, if Trevor Noah does a segment about how gender reveal parties are silly and could be seen as offensive since the child hasn't actually chosen their gender yet, Ted Cruz might, like a weird little online freak who forgets that he's a senator, quote tweet that by saying liberal males do tend to not grow balls. We could spend some time talking about how sex isn't the same thing as gender, or we could talk about the idea of Ted Cruz saying someone doesn't have any balls. But maybe we'll save that for the end. It's just a small example of little Ted. Another great example of this evolution of the GOP into a bunch of weird little online freaks is from Trump sycophant and normal head haver Matt Gaetz. John Cryer of 2.5 Men tweeted, "Rep. Matt Gaetz invited a white supremacist to the State of the Union, attempted to intimidate a federal witness, and endorsed a sociopathic bigot who applauded the deaths of migrants for Congress." Now, in response to these true things that a normal congressperson might want to either explain or deny, Matt tweeted, "Charlie Sheen carried 2.5 Men, utter nonsense," from a congressperson, in response to the fact that he invited a white supremacist to the State of the Union. Now, in response to this, instead of being like, "Why did you say that?" instead of responding to the accurate claims, John's ego got hurt, and so he talked about how many Emmys he won after Sheen left the show, so good shit all around, I guess. But this is the kind of thing our lawmakers spend their time on these days. Trying to be the Trump Twitter troll, just dunking on Bette Midler or whatever, instead of, being a senator. The same week of the anniversary of Ted Cruz liking a porn tweet on the anniversary of 9/11, Donald Trump released his list of possible Supreme Court picks if he wins again. Ted Cruz was on that list. Now, there's a lot to unpack about that. For example, the original list that Donald Trump gave years ago for his potential Supreme Court picks didn't have Gorsuch or Kavanaugh on that list. So this is just a list of names. Also, Ted Cruz at that time pledged to keep the Supreme Court seat open for 4 years if Hillary won, because he's a vile worm. Also, pretty sure this was simply a favor to Ted because he had a book about the Supreme Court coming out. And so on the same day the list was released, Ted was like, "Buy my book." Also, Ted Cruz has since responded to this by saying that he's honored to be on the list because he really cares about Donald Trump's opinion about him and his wife and so on. But he doesn't see himself on the Supreme Court. He wants to stay in the fight, in the Senate. That's what he sees himself spending years in the Senate, fighting the good fight. Now, this is extra interesting because one of the things that Ted Cruz and Donald Trump agree on as a team is that there should be term limits on Congress. Not the worst idea. Donald Trump put this promise at the top of his list of promises in 2016. That promise remains on the 2020 platform for the GOP because he didn't do anything about it, despite the fact that Ted Cruz has written an amendment to limit terms in Congress. Of course, the amendment that Ted Cruz wrote doesn't include Congress people who have already exceeded those limits, so if you've been in Congress for like 5 terms, the limit to 2 terms wouldn't take effect until the next term, so you could get another term. Very clever, Ted. Clever boy. Anyway, that amendment was written and ready to go 4 years ago. But Ted didn't bring it up at all or try to pass it at all because Ted Cruz is a lying fraud worm who doesn't believe in much of anything. He wants to be fighting the good fight in the Senate for years. That's where he sees himself. Also, there should be term limits for Congress, but also he's going to be there for years fighting the good fight. Anyway, we could spend hours going balls deep into Ted Cruz's rich history of obvious hypocrisy and all the things he said about Donald Trump being horrible and how he pretends he didn't and that it's all good now and his record and his AstroTurf Tea Party movement and how he helped steal the 2000 election from George W. Bush and how he was openly disliked by everyone in politics regardless of party. And maybe we will do that when he's up for re-election, despite, his view on term limits. But that's not what this is about. So instead, before the real point of this, here's just a quick rundown of some of his weird little freaky tweets. Like his tweets about fucking Goya beans and how the left is trying to silence free speech by boycotting them, even though, boycotts are a form of free speech. And also, the president that Ted Cruz loves tries to cancel Nike and, I don't know, fucking Barbara Streisand twice a fucking week. Weird that Ted Cruz, champion of free speech, has nothing to say about the president saying that if you burn the American flag, you should go to jail for a year.
You burn the flag, you should go to jail for 1 year. I really mean that.
Here's Ted Cruz challenging an actor to wrestle someone who isn't Ted Cruz. Here he is commenting, "Communists!" on an article that suggests trying other foods on holidays. Ted has developed a habit of regularly retweeting Andy No, a blatant fraud and fascist propagandist who is such an obvious fraud that he pretended to have a fake British accent for several months.
I've attended mandatory training on social justice and media, and I've been taught about factoring in power dynamics of people.
Portland, Oregon is a extremely progressive city in the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. And I call it a political monoculture.
Here he is retweeting videos of a swan pulling someone's mask on and calling the swan a goose. Here he is retweeting a lie about how Bank of America is donating $1 billion to Black Lives Matter, a thing they weren't doing. Here he is tweeting out Antifa.com, which links to a Joe Biden donation page. Thanks for the link, Ted. And he pretends as though he doesn't understand that it's an obvious troll website and Antifa and Joe Biden are completely not related. This makes sense, though, considering free speech hero Ted Cruz wrote a law trying to label Antifa terrorists to stop them from protesting, and his law used Antifa and left-wing activism interchangeably because he's a fascist goon and he wants to blur the lines. It's a shame that environmentalism in America is exclusively seen as left-wing. Hope your law isn't used irresponsibly, Ted. You'd hate that. Here's Ted digging up a 2-year-old tweet from Jim Acosta to say that people want to destroy Mount Rushmore, while also claiming that the protests are full of raping, murderous Antifa. Gonna need a link for those rapes, Ted. The raping Antifa, who you liken to left-wing activism and any Democrat. Here he is asking why anyone would elect these goofballs in Congress with masks on their faces, despite this existing. Here he is claiming that someone is defending child porn despite that person not doing that. Because again, he wants to blur the lines and has no concern about getting people murdered. Here he is posting about how some angry lefty actor thinks California is the only place that has summer. It's hot everywhere. Try Texas every summertime. But the rest of the country doesn't have such a dysfunctional state government that you can't turn the lights on or run AC. That's a policy failure of the Dems. Despite this article from a year earlier, almost to the day, which reads, "The Energy Reliability Council of Texas appealed to all of the state's consumers of electric power to limit and reduce their usage during the peak demand hours of 3 to 7 p.m. Tuesday after reserve capacity fell below 2,300 megawatts. High temperatures have resulted in record electricity demand over the last few days and may result in a new record today," said ERCOT President and CEO Bill Magnus. "Consumers can help lower energy consumption by taking some simple actions between the hours of 3 and 7 p.m. While defending the claim that Trump is untouchable by the law, which, oh boy, I mean, maybe, I don't know, Ted told Lawrence Tribe, "Trump has broken you," which, funny stuff, Ted. Here's Ted Cruz retweeting a Muppet tweet about how love is love, you can love who you want, and claiming that it's about sex? A thing the 9/11 porn tweet liker loves to do. See, for the past few days, Ted Cruz has been obsessively tweeting about something on Netflix called Cuties, which is about how the sexual exploitation of young girls is bad, something I think we can all agree on. Now, some scenes and images from the movie are pretty gross and not something I'm going to show you. And I'm sure there's an actual reasonable conversation to be had about this. But Ted Cruz is using this as an opportunity to paint all lefties as pedophiles who support child porn, as seen earlier in that other tweet, despite that not being a thing that is happening. And despite the current president having an entire page in Jeffrey Epstein's Little Black Book, images like this with his young daughter, bragging about walking into the changing room of teen beauty queens, more than one Trump campaign campaign chair pleading guilty to charges of sex trafficking. The 8-year Republican Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, being a convicted pedophile. Ted Cruz retweeting James Woods, who tried to pick up Amber Tamblyn when she was 16 and he knew she was 16. And Ted Cruz himself defending child molester Roy Moore. Also, decades of actual pageants, of actual young girls doing this shit. For real. A lot of them in Texas. But Ted Cruz doesn't care because he's a wormy little troll who can't log the off. In response to people saying he's just throwing